Got it. We're live. We're going to give Facebook just like 1 minute or so to let everybody know that we're here. And back with two of my personal favorite ladies out there. Aimie, Runyan, welcome back.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yep. And Rachel, as always, I love having you and your wonderful conversation. So thanks for coming back again with us.
Oh, thank you. Hi, Warwicks. I love you guys.
Yep, we just have so much fun. I just still adore doing the virtual events because it gives us the opportunity to just highlight and talk about so many great books and with so many great authors. So Thank you both for being here. Whoever's watching this, thank you for watching with us. If you're on Facebook with us live, in that comment section, I'm going to put Amy's new book, A Bakery in Paris, which that is what Rachel and Aimie will be talking about today. I'll put that in the comment section. That's also where we'd like you to, Rachel and Aimie are going to talk for about 30 minutes today. We'd love you to put some questions into the comment section if you have for Aimie or Rachel, so don't be shy on that. And I'll be also putting in Rachel's book in that comment section too. If you're watching on YouTube later, just stick with us. This is going to be a great conversation. We're not live with you, but I love the recorded conversations too. So without further ado, like I said earlier, we're pleased to bring back internationally best-selling author Aimie Runyan, who writes to celebrate unsung heroines. She has written 6, it might be 7 historical novels now. Which number do I have right? Is it 6 or 7 historical? 7? 7 historical novels, and is delving into the exciting world of contemporary women's fiction. As I said, she's here today to talk about her latest book, A Bakery in Paris, with author extraordinaire, great friend of Warwick's, and all-around wonderful human being, Rachel McMillan.
Aw, thanks.
So ladies, have a great conversation. We'll see you in about a half hour.
Thanks, Julie. So Aimie, you talk about unsung heroines in fiction, but with this book, Bakery in Paris, you're talking about what I think, for the most part, is an unsung moment in Paris history. For any readers out there who like Diana Biller like I do, she has touched on the siege of Paris in one of her recent romances, and Aimie and Diana will be in a conversation soon, right? At Ripped Bodice. Yes. But tell us more about the siege of Paris, where you stumbled across it, and why you think it's going to be a new, unique, and empowering experience for your readers to learn about in A Bakery in Paris.
Well, okay, so the siege of Paris was the first of 3 times where the German forces marched all the way into Paris after a terrible defeat of the French army in Sedan, which is a bad luck place for the French if you follow history. And so they surrounded the city of Paris and were basically, the emperor was displaced. And it was a really hard time for the people of Paris. As you can imagine, it is a walled city. I don't think people envision it that way, but it really is. So it can be completely sealed off, which means that if you're on the inside, you're starving.
What year are you just for readers who are not familiar? I don't want them to hear Germans in Paris and think we're talking about the Second World War, like every other book.
No,
what year are we talking about?
1870. This is the
1870, everybody.
Yes, 1870. It's a skirmish between the French and the Germans that we don't hear so much about. And it was interesting, not just because of the conflict itself, but because of what it gave rise to, which is the Paris Commune. For 2 months, in March through May of 1871, the people of Paris rose up against the Versailles, the French army of the emperor, and governed themselves. And it was a moment, because we have to remember, everybody thinks of Paris as this big unified government with a central language, a central government, and anti-monarchist. But everybody thinks the French Revolution was the start of it, and it really, the French Revolution was like a symbolic victory, but they had a monarchy again 12 years later. So it really was a failed attempt that everybody lauds, everybody learns about in school, but it failed ultimately. But after the Paris Commune, there was never a monarchy again. And the reason being that the Versailles murdered 25,000 Parisians for participating, either whether they were innocent, guilty, or somewhere in between, for participating as communards, as they were called. And the reprisal against the communards was so swift that even the people who were not necessarily in favor of the people's uprising in Paris sided with the commune because of the reprisal being so disproportionate to what actually happened. And there was never a monarchy again. Now, that's not to say that the elite rule didn't take over again, but it wasn't a monarchy in the sense that it was. And so it really was a turning point in French history. And the interesting part is also that the women protected the cannons in Montmartre and kept the people's cannons from being taken away by the French army. And so that's where the women's centric part of A Bakery in Paris takes place.
And Montmartre is where the center of your book is set. And I wondered,
yes,
how did you stumble across this history? I mean, you've written about the French women's experience before. Your first two books actually were about the Filles du Roi, about French women who came from France and were appointed by the king to come and marry husbands in the New World, which is Quebec in Canada, where I live and where you studied. Have you known about the Commune and the siege for a long time? Or how did you stumble upon telling this particular story? Because your previous book, School for German Brides, is a World War II work of fiction. This is a bit of a departure. And how did you come across all of this?
Okay, so it's actually a very sweet story. I was hunting for new ideas after Across the Winding River, and I had the idea for what would become my part of Castle Keepers out and about, and people said, we don't think that this is the right moment. So I ended up using it for Castle Keepers, which is great.
We should
and I had the idea
reappropriate things.
Always.
Waste
and
research.
I had the idea, I had the idea for German Brides in my back pocket and ended up pitching that to William Morrow. But I was talking with this gentleman I was dating who was a historian about different ideas that I could pitch because I knew that I was on the cusp of maybe changing publication houses and things like that. And he said, well, Aimie, you were a French major, you have a master's in French, you should write about the Paris Commune because it's an interesting period. And I thought that if I paired that with post-World War II, which is, an area that we don't talk about too much, it's like, and then they were fine because the war was over.
Yeah.
And there was a dark period where they were rebuilding. And I wanted to touch on that and talk about the aftermath of war and how horrific it really is and how people really people really struggled to rebuild their lives. And I thought the two narratives together would make it easier to pitch to a house because 1870s isn't the period that people reflexively know that much about, but pairing it with something that was tangentially related and that I could use for an overarching theme, I thought would make it really accessible, but also help transition me to writing a slightly different time period. And the great spoiler is that historian that helped pitch the idea, I married him a year later.
Yeah, I was like, if you were dating this historian, is this Jeremy?
Yes, it's Jeremy.
So good for him.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
This book is lavishly dedicated to Jeremy. I got the book deal offer on our honeymoon. When I was reading a book called Massacre by John Merriman about the Paris Commune, aloud to him in the car. Yeah, so this is definitely my Jeremy book. And I highly recommend for all historical fiction authors out there, an in-house historian is invaluable.
So
if you can pick one up.
Make sure you're dating historians. And yes, the parallel is quite wonderful between the experience of the Parisians in both post-war, but also in the 1870 time period. But this is not the only research that you did. You are, and I know this, Aimie is a bona fide foodie and baker and loves to be in the kitchen. And make sure that you go and follow her social media accounts. Perhaps Julie will even put her handle or her Instagram and Facebook in the comments here, because Aimie has actually been showing her love for her food and baking prowess with the launch of this book by creating videos inspired by the recipes that are integral to A Bakery in Paris. So you as a historical novelist, do a lot of research about history, but was there anything you had to do in terms of research for the food and baking part of this book?
Oh, absolutely. So what I did, because there are recipes you'll see throughout the book, and I would not recommend that you follow these. Go ahead and come to my socials, and I will give you more modernized, because it says put it in a hot oven. What the heck is a hot oven? Which is 450 degrees, by the way. But I took original carême recipes and just made them more readable and adjusted them, put some literary stuff in there. And some of that was for quite a few of them. And then for other recipes, I invented my own stuff.
I love that. You invented. Aimie knows I'm a huge fan of B. Dylan Hollis, whose book just came out. And one of the things I love about him is that, like Aimie, he's always trying to find a way to put old recipes within the context of our contemporary time period, right? So you have done a lot of freaking baking that your family and friends have benefited from.
Yes, everything from blackberry clafoutis yesterday for launch day to rose petal jam that I'll do a video about. Rose petal jam complete with fancy labels from Michelin's bakery. Let's see what else. I made the dark chocolate cheesecake, which is a recipe that's live now, which is not from the book, but it's a personal favorite. It was my wedding cake.
No one's gonna get mad at having a recipe for a dark chocolate cheesecake.
No, it's fabulous.
Did you find that you learned something in the research for this about baking or cookery that surprised you? Because you already knew a lot to begin with. Was there a particular nugget or something that stood out as, wow, I never knew that before?
Well, I mean, I thought one of the most interesting food-related researchers was dealing with the black market during the Paris Commune.
Oh yeah,
or the Siege of Paris, and trying to get her hands on flour so she could feed her neighborhood. And that was fascinating, and how much flour the average bakery used. And the whole point of our heroine Lisette opening the bakery was to feed the people of Montmartre, giving them access to food, because the whole concept of a food desert that we talk about nowadays in rural America, it existed even in Paris. In parts, people would have to walk. If you look at a map of Paris now, even today, there aren't a ton of bakeries in that particular corner of Montmartre if you compare it to Paris, if you compare it to wealthier areas. And of course now it's like filled. I mean, there's a Starbucks across the street from the bakery that inspired a bakery in Paris. But if people had to walk a half hour or an hour to the next arrondissement over, because Paris is it takes a long time to walk through Paris.
It's a huge city.
Yeah. And bearing in mind, these people probably weren't wealthy enough to own horses or anything. It would have been an hour out of their day. And we cannot overstate the importance of bread in the French diet. People are eating a pound or two of the stuff in a day. And the fact that a lot of the measurements were still in the imperial system with pounds and ounces and things was super interesting too.
And that's something that, something that a lot of us know, but like the weather, Americans are kind of an anomaly in using a different system. So did you find it difficult to transfer to the France system smart and creation, or did you just pick it up like that?
No, because they were using the one thing that other countries do for baking that we should do, a good American bakers do it too. They measure their ingredients by weight instead of by volume. And so the measurements were like a pound of flour instead of 3 cups of flour. So I mean, it makes sense as long as you've got a food scale. It all makes sense. But if you look at a really solid cookbook, a baking book, it's all in weight anyway.
And one of the things that I think readers will love if they follow you is that you're sharing pictures inspired by your on-site research for Bakery in Paris, because you did get to go to Paris after all of the COVID lockdowns. And I know you have a family and you're very careful about how your health is influencing the people around you. Can you talk about what it was like to go to Paris specifically with this book's world in mind? How did that play out for you?
Yeah, well, it was really interesting because I actually got to go to Paris when the book was in copy edits, and then again after I
Yeah.
had an advanced review copy. I got to go twice, which is amazing considering I hadn't been in 12 years before that. But going to see the places and knowing like, oh my gosh, that house, that should totally be like a so-and-so's house from the book. But going to see the Place des Vosges, which I don't think I'd ever had the chance to visit in person before, and getting the sensory details of what it was like to walk on they have that specialized, and I cannot remember, I put this detail in the book in copy edits, but the ground up soil that they have that's like whitewash and ground up pebbles that they have outside of Versailles, they have it in the Jardin des Tuileries, and in the Place des Vosges it's like tan and stabilisé, and just the sound of that under your feet, and imagining her, that's the only place where she's allowed to go inside the corridor of the Place des Vosges, which is like an encircled courtyard, and how maddening it must be for her to hear that sound of the crunch under her feet was something that I couldn't have captured if I hadn't been. And the sneering face of Louis XIII on his horse in a statue over the place, and going to see the actual bakery, because I had to write this book with the help of Google Maps and Google Street View. And I chose a particular bakery, and I was going to buy some pastries and a coffee and tell the owner I was writing a book about their bakery. And I go, and the place is boarded up. And I realized, even though I checked the hours many times, and it was like top of my to-do list, it had permanently closed about 6 weeks before my trip.
No, that's awful, but there are still pictures of it, and it looks quite stunning from the outside.
And it is, I mean, it really is from the outside, and it is exactly as I described it, just a lighter shade of green. And the top story where the family would have lived is actually an Airbnb, but I never got to go inside the bakery itself. But as sad as it is, I guess it's nice not to have my perfect image of it in my head changed. I didn't have some rude exchange with somebody inside, anything to take away from the experience. So it always was going to be Micheline and Lisette's bakery in my head. Le Bijou, it'll always be Le Bijou.
Which has an apron now. You wear your Le Bijou apron when you're on your videos.
I do. Yes, I have my Le Bijou apron. Yep.
And I think that it's interesting because you talk so much about your obvious you're an aficionado of French history. Did you start with the siege and then create the post-war period? How did you come to balance the two women's stories that intersect so seamlessly in Bakery in Paris?
Well, it was interesting is that I decided to do something different, because I've done like multi-strand books before, whether it's usually different narrators. The timelines I've not messed with before. But what I decided to do is I wrote all of Lisette's timeline first. And it was, I had just breezed through it compared to some other projects I've worked on. I breezed through it in like 6 weeks. And it was just a joy. I loved writing her story. And I was at 50,000 words by the time I was done with hers. And I'm like, I've got 2 timelines left. This will be interesting. And I wrote Micheline's, the 1946 timeline. And it went well, but I'm like, I am running out of words. I am at 30,000 words. I've got like 10 to 15, 20,000 max words left. What am I going to do? So I stopped and I started writing what was supposed to be the third timeline, the 1990s timeline with their great to whatever degree granddaughter. Veronica was going to come and reopen the bakery after an extended closure, which would have been appropriate knowing that the place is shuttered now. But it just wasn't working. I was trying and trying and trying, and I was beating my head against the wall for 2 weeks, and I did not want to lose more writing time. And so I emailed my lovely editor, Tessa Woodward at Morrow, and I said, can I just axe the modern day timeline? And she's like, I'm not prescriptive. You do what you want. If you feel like that's what's best for the book, do it. So I cut it. I took some of those elements and wrapped them into my first contemporary, just some of the vibes, there's like one particular scene where she's like standing in the middle of a filthy room and trying to decide what to do. I took that and recycled it for something else. But I just expanded Micheline's timeline for another 20,000 words. And then I went about weaving them together, and I was worried about how the rise and fall just wouldn't match. And it actually wasn't that big of a problem because they both really had the natural rise and fall together. And I thought it worked out really well, actually. I was really panicked at first, but it kind of came together.
It worked. And for readers who don't know, or perhaps are new to the publishing industry, every author is contracted based on word count. Word count determines the price of the book. Word counts determine the advance that an author gets when they're hired to write the book. Word count is really important. So when Aimie talks about being at a certain word count and she still has this much left, it's a huge thing because you have to make sure that you're pacing and tempering the story in a way that's going to make it a great book, but also within the rubrics of what you were contracted to do. And you mentioned that you've mentioned a few times your contemporary story. This is not your first time in France. Obviously, we can tell just by listening to you that you are proficient in the language. You wrote about the Filles du Roi. You're writing this book. You have a book coming out, another historical called Mademoiselle Eiffel. Eiffel, is that how we say her name? And then Eiffel, and then we've got your first contemporary with Harper Muse called Memory of Lavender and Sage, which is set not in Paris but in Provence and has a bit of magic realism to it. Obviously, you studied France. What do you want your readers to take away from your love of this country and its culture?
Oh, just that it's so much more than it's depicted on TV and in movies. It's such a deep and wonderful and complex culture. And in A Bakery in Paris, I wanted to talk about how the resilience of Paris in her darkest moments, and that was kind of a theme I wanted to show there, and the resilience of Parisian women who had seen and endured so much and lost so much, and even if they survived when their husbands, brothers and fathers and boyfriends did not, they bore the scars all the same. Now with The Memory of Lavender and Sage, which is coming out next February, it's a contemporary novel, and it is my love letter to Provence, where I lived and studied for over a year, and I just absolutely adore that region of France. And it is so different, and they have their own language. And that was something that actually came about from the Siege of Paris, was that people in France did not speak standard Parisian French in 1870. People in Paris and the highly educated spoke Parisian French. And then in other regions of France, they had regional languages. Like in Brittany, they spoke Breton. In Provence, they spoke Provençal. In Alsace, they spoke Alsacien. And those languages, they basically created a teaching system. They required the education be free, mandatory, and secular for everybody, boys and girls, starting from age 6 to, I can't remember, 17, I believe. And it had to be in French. And so they'd take a teacher from Normandy and send them to Provence, a teacher from Provence and send them to Alsace, so on and so forth. And so was a regional identity that was actively fought against in the late 19th century. And you have these wonderful poets like Frédéric Mistral who are trying to cling to that Provençal heritage. And so The Memory of Lavender and Sage, while it's a contemporary novel, does pay homage to that regional identity that I would love for people to know about. But it's also a tribute to the dying village in France, because there are villages in France and also in Spain and Portugal and Italy where there's not a resident under the age of 60 because all the jobs are elsewhere. It's a brain drain. And these villages are shrinking to the point where there's no cafes, no grocery stores. And when the school dies, when they say, oh, you got 20 kids left, we're just going to bus them to the next town over. That's when the families leave. And that's when the village dies. And that's the kind of crisis moment that this beautiful little village in Provence is coming across in The Memory of Lavender and Sage. And I mean, we have the similar effect in the United States with small towns emptying out, but it's to a different degree, and we have our own rural flight problem. But in France, it's just everybody's moving to a handful of cities, and in Portugal, it's really stark. Everybody's moving to Porto and Lisbon, and everything else is just emptying out, and it's heartbreaking.
Accent in the oral history, we have it in Cape Breton, which is an island here in Nova Scotia, which is my favorite province in Canada. If ever anyone comes to Canada, go to Cape Breton, go to Nova Scotia. It's the most beautiful part of my country. And it's a lot of that. There are not enough jobs to keep people in those towns, so they have to move elsewhere. And you worry about the loss of the history. And that's why it's so important that you're preserving it in your books, especially this one. And you've mentioned many times that Bakery in Paris is your love of your life. It is your book that you are just so passionate about. I mean, all authors love their books. Well, they hate them and love them at the same time, but you've mentioned that this one is a particular favorite. I know that there's a gushing dedication to your husband because of his influence in it, but can you tell us why this particular book is so special to you out of all the awesome books that you've written with your lovely characters?
Yeah, it was one of the books. I mean, well, and I had my other soft spot is for Girls on the Line, and the research was just incredible for that book. I mean, you've got stories about that book for days and how the world came to me on that book. But this book was just, I knew what I wanted to achieve with it, and I felt like I was able to do it. And after, The School for German Brides being a book that I felt compelled to write, but it was endurance because it was such dark.
It's a dark book.
Yeah. It is a dark book. And this one is dark too. Let's not pretend that people starving in the streets of Paris isn't dark. But it was a book of triumph, and it was my post-COVID book and coming out of the darkness. I mean, and let's not say post-COVID because I'm still masking y'all. But post stay-at-home orders, and things are sort of resembling a sense of normalcy. But it was a book where I felt the characters came to me almost fully formed, and I feel like it was a book that I was able to put a lot of myself into, and that's a very vulnerable thing. And I think that's part of the reason if anybody is close in my inner circles, I have been a mess for about a month leading up to the launch of this book, because if this book flops, it feels like a personal failure on a level that my other books haven't, because there's so much of my soul born in this book. But I think that becomes more and more true with each book. I think that I become more vulnerable as an artist with each book and willing to put more of myself into each of them. And so it's, definitely, I feel like this is a book that it was one of those things where I felt like I was put on the planet to write one. This is one of the ones that I was meant to do. And I loved, I'm sure that if I look back honestly without rose-colored glasses, there were moments of frustration, but compared to some of the other books, it was a joy. It was an absolute joy.
Flowed. And I have two more questions for you. The first is, do you have a favorite recipe from Bakery in Paris?
The rose petal jam is probably the most special because of what it represents to Micheline and her beau Laurent. And it's made with rose petals that her great grandparents planted. And so I actually replicated the recipe, and I've made it. I haven't even tasted it yet because I've been so busy, but I need to.
You took pictures though. It exists, everybody. It exists.
It does. I have like 7 jars in my refrigerator. So yeah, if you follow the recipe, if you double it, you're gonna end up with 11 jars of jam. That's a lot of jam, people.
Christmas gifts. And then my final question for you is what I like to ask all authors, because we're all readers. Are there a few books that are out or coming out, or that you're really enjoying, or that you feel that we need to know about?
Well, I shared my launch day, and I feel neglectful because I did not post about them on social media, but I'm going to.
Oh, but every book in the world released yesterday. As an author and a book person, and for me as an agent, I'm always terrified I'm going to miss somebody. I actually get nervous on Tuesdays because I'm like, I'm going to miss somebody. Yesterday, every book on the planet came out, of which yours was one, and it was all good books, so it's not your fault. I think everybody was freaking out. It's like, how do I share them all?
Yeah, there's an Anne Patchett came out, but so there were two books in particular that came out yesterday. The Keeper of Hidden Books by my dear friend Madeline Martin.
Yay!
And there's no coming back from this. I was thinking of a different line, her previous title. But there's no coming back from this by Anne Garvin, the founder of the Tall Poppy Writers, which sounds like a hoot. I've got the audio book cranked and ready to go because I love listening to light, funny
And
books
she
on
has
audio.
done so much interesting research on Hollywood, on all of that world for
so
this.
much.
So
Yeah, and
yeah.
Madeline's research. Oh, we could
she's
talk about that for a
insane.
whole half hour.
I
Yeah,
don't know
like
how
the
she
level
has
of
the time
research.
to do it.
No,
And
she
she went
is
to
so talented with the research.
Poland, and I mean, if you follow Madeline on any social, you're going to see her pictures from all of the research and places that she went. So yay, books.
Yeah, and I respect her so much because she takes it so seriously. But of course, we have a special book, To Free the Stars, by our dear friend Janelle Soselsky, that comes out next Tuesday. She's our co-author for The Castle Keepers, as well as our upcoming The Liberty Scarf. And it is kind of
So
a
good.
Winter Soldier reimagining. And, you know, Janelle is just amazing. And she's doing, you know, she has such quirky, wonderful heroines. And I think that she is a rising star of historical fiction. And I just hope that she, you know, sells a zillion copies because she deserves it. She's amazing.
She really does.
She is awesome. She'll be with us next week. Rachel, you didn't do the interview with, I'm giving you some grief. She's doing it with Fiona Davis.
She's with Fiona. I can't. It's Fiona Davis. Fiona Davis wants to interview anybody. It's Fiona Davis.
Well, we love having you. You know that.
Like, I can fangirl like the rest of them over Fiona Davis.
So
She's
Fiona
awesome.
and Janelle will be in
That's gonna be
conversation
great.
with us next Wednesday. So for all of you
That's
watching
fabulous.
right now,
Yeah,
come back next
well,
Wednesday.
I think that's so sweet because Janelle got to interview Fiona at a bookstore event a few months ago. So I think it's lovely that Fiona's doing that.
I do
That
too.
is so
I
great.
think it's great. I think
She
it's
seems like an
awesome.
amazing person.
I just love all of you and all of us that are like just uplifting everybody where we can.
Mhm.
You know, it's just is a thing that we all just have to do, and it's so much fun. And talking about books is just.
Yeah, and isn't it the best part of this entire industry? And honestly, the part that I did not expect, because I'd been in theater a little bit, and I expected it to be cutthroat, kind of like that. Like when they say break a leg, they mean it. And with writing, I mean, with very few exceptions, everybody has been so supportive and wonderful, and it makes it so easy to do that in return. And I find that the people that aren't uplifting and loving to their fellow authors, they're not going to make it, because that's what it takes. You know, it takes being a part of the community to be a success in this.
Well,
so
because
I love uplifting.
It's not a zero-sum game.
No,
because the readers are reading faster than you can write.
Yeah.
So they're looking for things to read in between when you all are writing what you're writing. So there's plenty of room in this field.
There's so much room, and people don't realize that. It's a very tough industry, but
it is. I mean, it's hard. That's why we love doing what we do with uplifting when we can, because it's so hard to rise above the noise. Because there is just so much. There is a lot out there, but you can find a lane, and you find people that you like, who you recommend things to, and you know, oh, she liked this one, I'm gonna like that one, you know. So that's what's really fun about it. Okay, two things that I was not cracking up about, but I was because I was doing a little, I have to do my little thing, my tech stuff in the background. Did I hear that? Is it Parisians previously or now eat a pound of bread?
No, previously. Okay. I think they're definitely adjusting to the anti-carb movement.
Okay.
But yeah, Parisians, basically their diet consisted of bread and then a watery soup of whatever they could get their hands on if they were lucky.
But I think that there's still something about how they move and eat that is, even with the carbs, they seem to do.
I think it's why there's the whole French woman don't get fat movement from the 2000s.
Right.
I think there's something that's so romantic to people that lures them to Paris because of the cuisine, the baguettes, the wine, the cheese.
Well, I think it has a lot to do with no preservatives, no stuff like that.
Oh, I'm sure.
I'm sure.
Well, yeah, exactly. I was putting in because I wear my fitness watch. I was putting in 30,000 steps. Now it was also saying I was detraining because I was at sea level and I live at 8,000 feet. And it's like, what are you doing? Like, it's coasting. But you know, it really is a country where food is so respected, it's not abused.
Right.
And even
Yeah.
the junk food in France, they don't include a lot of the same preservatives and artificial coloring. And it's, you know, it's really considered like gauche to eat junk food.
Right.
It really is.
Well, their junk food is those wonderful pastries that are in that
Yes.
bakery.
But you have one, if you look, and the sugar content, and it's funny is that as a baker, I'm actually a pretty big anti-sugar zealot. I reduce the amount of sugar in all my recipes to as little as I can stand, because
Right.
sugar, I think, is the enemy. I hate to say it, but it really is.
Right.
But I mean, the French pastries, if you look at an American croissant, it's about that big. A French croissant is that big, and it probably has a tenth of the sugar.
Right. Well, that was, and then the other thing that I just thought was so poignant and how you pointed it out, and it's just so sad, is the villages that are dying. And that
Yeah.
just is, it changes the country's landscape and how
does.
people experience the country and how the, you know, people who live there. And it's just, and like you said, we have it here in the United States. I'm sure, Rachel, in Canada, you
Yeah.
have the same things happening, but it just, for whatever reason, some of those old villages in those countries that had been there for not just hundreds but thousands of years,
Oh,
probably.
it's
Mhm.
treacherous.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
yeah, and I just know I stumbled across articles when I was doing research about the flight from the villages, and when the school is gone, when the school, they start busing the kids to another school, that's when the city dies or the village dies, and it's heartbreaking. It really is. Yeah, and so that was the I set out to write fun escapist fiction, and I end up writing a treatise to my love letter of small town France. But you know, it's
love
Aimie.
it.
What can we do?
I love it. Well, A Bakery in Paris out yesterday. Everybody get your hands on it. We're so happy to have you back again.
Look at that cover.
It's such a good cover.
And they did. It was like 2 iterations. It was the easiest cover.
We love that cover. And like I said, we always have room for more books. So we've got both of you coming out with some things coming in the future. So
Yeah.
look.
Yeah,
for
we can
more
talk about The
conversations.
Memory of Lavender and Sage and Operation Scarlet.
Yeah.
Can't wait for Operation
Yeah.
Scarlet.
I can't either, everybody. I can't either. Will this book ever be done? She says on the
Yes.
3rd round of copy edits.
I
Someday.
know how that goes.
But it will be worth the wait. It will be worth the wait. Aimie, thank you for coming in with us
Thank
again.
you for having me.
Wonderful. Rachel, another great
Thanks, Amy.
conversation.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. Stay cool.
Goodbye,
happy-
everybody. Have a good
and-
night.
Happy reading.
Bye.